In the last chapter, we saw MacIntyre's analysis of two ethical theories called expressivism and neo-Aristotelianism. According to his analysis, these are rival and incompatible theories that present starkly contrasting pictures of the nature of the ethical life, of the structure of practical reasoning, and even of the nature of the human self and its self-understanding. They appear to be incommensurable as well. That is, there is no set of shared principles or assumptions from which one could decide for the one or the other. And both will have criticisms of the other, but from their own point of view, based upon their own premises, which will not be shared by the other point of view. This represented a theoretical impasse. Now, MacIntyre entertains the possibility that this impasse could be the artifact of the narrowly academic nature of the dispute. Doesn't a philosophical investigation into the questions of morality and politics require, one might ask, some knowledge of the range of moralities and the range of political concerns, as these are studied by the disciplines of history, anthropology, and sociology, for example? Academics lead sheltered lives, limited in their life experience. So MacIntyre puts forward the thesis that moral theory is rooted in and unintelligible apart from moral practice. That's an important one, so I'll say it again. Moral theory is rooted in and unintelligible apart from moral practice. This is a thesis that, while philosophical, is difficult to prove by standard philosophical methods. So MacIntyre's way of proving it is to produce historical examples that illustrate the relationship. This is non-standard in philosophy, which makes a point about the drawbacks of academic specialization. Now, academic philosophical ethical inquiry grows out of everyday practical inquiries of the plain person, as MacIntyre refers to them. And how these inquiries go varies based upon the particularities of culture and society. Even the tendency of modern academic moral philosophers to pose the question, how am I to act, indicates a cultural bias. Academic moral philosophers will ask, how am I to act, as opposed to, how are we to act? How am I to act? And take this as a matter of course, as opposed to thinking of the original ethical question in terms of an already assumed plural subject. How are we to act? MacIntyre asks whether what he calls the standpoint of practical reason, or the standpoint of the self-aware practical reasoner, can overcome this theoretical impasse. He suggests that the ordinary self-aware person engaging in practical reflection goes through many of the phases of the ethical life that Aristotle had highlighted. When ordinary people engage in practical reflection, they become self-aware in at least three ways. They make explicit the ethical concepts and theses that they had hitherto presupposed without being aware of it. Second, they discover the realities of their practical lives by framing narratives of their failure or success as practical reasoners. And third, they thereby discover a directedness in their lives, an uneven movement towards some end state. That is, something that sounds a lot like teleology in the Aristotelian sense. Ordinary people, in the course of their practical reflections, also have learned to take seriously the judgment of perceptive others, especially those who exhibit the qualities of mind and character that they've learned to value. Compare here friendship in Aristotle and its role. They will also learn to, as MacIntyre says, quote, suspect themselves that is, mistrust themselves, in situations in which in the past they have become the victim of their own desires. This sounds a lot like Aristotelian incontinence and its problems. They will have learned to give due weight to the constraints that the norms of justice impose. And we have seen also in the Nicomachean Ethics, this is something that Aristotle emphasizes as well. Their reasoning, the ordinary people's reasoning, is marked by what MacIntyre calls a certain circularity, in that the conclusions they reach are going to be shaped and influenced by their habituation and upbringing. And this, of course, is also Aristotle's perspective. Ordinary self-aware practical reasoners must also have learned to deal with the two important sources of practical error: feelings and emotions on the one hand, and sociocultural biases on the other. They will have learned the need to discipline and transform the emotions throughout their lives. They will have learned to recognize when judgments that express their feelings have been unreliable and when judgments that express their feelings have been reliable, based upon their experience of success and failure in their life. And thus, whether they express their feelings will be considered by them to be irrelevant to whether they consider their judgments to be justified. That is, whether their judgments express their feelings is going to be irrelevant to whether they consider those judgments to be justified. The question is whether they express the kind of feelings that have proven to be connected with practical failure in the past or not. So these self-aware agents will have no quarrel when the expressivists suggest that judgments express feeling. They won't regard this as incompatible with the justification of those judgments by appeal to facts concerning human flourishing. On the other side, these self-aware rational agents will also regard the Neo-Aristotelians' appeals to human flourishing as simply a representation of the stances and reasoning of self-aware rational agents. So MacIntyre concludes on page 76. This is roughly in the middle of the large middle paragraph there on page 76. So self-aware rational agents may take themselves to be unthreatened by the disagreements of theorists, even when those disagreements are unresolvable. They may feel in particular unthreatened by either expressivism or Neo-Aristotelianism, finding a place for what each has to say within their own practical reflections. So it may seem, at least for a moment, that the impasse that we were unable to move beyond in our theorizing becomes irrelevant from the standpoint of practical agency and can be put aside. So when you're actually engaged in everyday practical agency, the expressivist perspective can be conceded to have some truth to it, and the Neo-Aristotelian perspective can be conceded to have some truth to it, and one doesn't need to necessarily opt for one or the other, even if, as they're framed theoretically, they're incompatible theories. It's not a practical problem. It's only a theoretical problem. That's the idea he's entertaining here. Now that we just might leave ethical theory completely to one side as irrelevant to our practical lives, and we engage in practical deliberations in a way that is roughly Aristotelian, but that isn't necessarily committed to contradicting anything the expressivist says in a sense either. So that's the possibility he's considering here. But he ultimately steps back from this, as you might expect from a philosophical theorist. He's not going to say that theory is irrelevant, theory doesn't matter. MacIntyre holds that even if the standpoint of ordinary self-aware moral agents must necessarily provide the starting point for philosophical theorizing, it can't replace it entirely. But the theorizing here doesn't mean academic moral philosophy in the usual sense, but rather a theorizing that enables rational agents to become aware of how their conception of human flourishing and excellence are due to the social and cultural tradition they inherit. In other words, this will be a theorizing that leads to a kind of cultural self-consciousness, kind of social self-awareness, awareness of the way in which one's own practical reasoning is rooted concretely in a particular historical circumstance and cultural circumstance. MacIntyre himself proposes to engage theoretically in a quarrel with the presently dominant moral system of our culture. And this is, as we discussed in the last video, what he calls morality with a capital M, which he will continue to discuss in the next chapter. Morality with a capital M, the presently dominant moral system in advanced societies. And he begins in this chapter to further unpack this notion. We already saw in the previous chapter that this is often associated with the idea of there being these impersonal maxims to which any rational agent must adhere, that these maxims are regarded typically as associated with things like the protection of rights and the maximization of the general welfare. And we're going to see further aspects of this morality system and an account of how it arose and what its implications are for society in this chapter and in later chapters as well. So this is a system that's characterized by the opposing poles of certain conceptions of utility and of individual human rights. And he mentions this on page 77. So basically a deontological conception that says that there are certain absolute principles that one needs to follow in any circumstance is contrasted with and in tension with basically the greatest happiness principle, the utilitarian idea that we have a rational obligation to produce the greatest happiness, a moral obligation to produce the greatest happiness in a completely impartial way. Both of these poles for MacIntyre are theoretically defective. Utility cannot be an independent or self-standing standard, since it presupposes a prior moral formation to influence what pleases us or pains us, what our preferences are. The notion of a human right, understood as, quote, rights attaching to each and every human individual, qua human individual, is completely ungrounded. MacIntyre claims, without arguing here, but says he could give an argument if necessary. He claims that there are no sound arguments for the existence of human rights. So on the one hand, we have utilitarianism, which is an incomplete theory because it presupposes that we already have preferences for things that please us or displease us. And therefore, it leaves completely out of account the fact that it's our prior moral formation that is going to determine what pleases us or displeases us, as we see, of course, in detail in Aristotle's theory. Also, in the case of a human right, this is an ungrounded notion that's just sort of plucked out of thin air without any justification. So both of these aspects of morality are, with a capital M, are deficient. Often appeals to utility and human rights do advance noble goals. I mean, in the past, historically, in the last 150 years or 200 years or so, there have been occasions where appeal to human rights, of course, have had laudable consequences, or where the desire to maximize the general welfare has had laudable consequences. But that's no reason to simply accept these as adequate theoretical constructs, because MacIntyre claims there are better arguments that could be used to advance those same goals. The protection of vulnerable individuals, for example, other than appeal to some fanciful notion of human rights. And it's equally the case that these discourses have had a more nefarious social function that should be subject to critical scrutiny. They can be misleading and they can be distorting. MacIntyre will argue that, quote, this is the bottom of 78, we need an account of how philosophical theorizing about morality, even powerful philosophical theorizing, does on occasion function so as to disguise and conceal key aspects of social realities of practice. So, unlike the typical self-image of the modern moral philosopher, modern moral philosophy, according to MacIntyre, has in fact not always, or even perhaps regularly, served to enlighten, to clarify, to reveal the structure of morality. But rather, it has served to do precisely the opposite. It has served to obfuscate, it has served to conceal, it has served to mask hidden agendas. And this is one of the functions he thinks that philosophical theorizing can have in this area, is to reveal this to be the case. But this is going to require engaging not typically in the standard forms of academic philosophy, constructing a priori arguments and so forth, but engaging in a kind of historical inquiry to show how this is the case, to show the interaction between moral philosophy and its historical context. And the first example he gives of this is a very important and influential one on moral philosophy, namely the example of David Hume. David Hume. He picks out 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume as a key exemplar of the way in which modern moral philosophy has served to disguise and conceal key aspects of social reality. Hume is also a good example for MacIntyre because he stands between expressivism and neo-Aristotelianism in a useful way. Expressivists are his heirs, and he contrasted his position with Aristotelianism in a clear way. For Hume, practical reasoning is entirely explained by what he calls, as an instrument of pleasure. Practical reasoning is entirely explained as an instrument of pleasure in Hume's term. That is, we reason instrumentally about the means to obtain what we desire, which is what causes us pleasure. That's what we desire, what causes us pleasure. So Hume lacks Aristotle's distinction between desires that attract because their objects are pleasing to the agent, on the one hand, and desires for objects taken to be good, on the other. For Hume, what we take to be good and what we find pleasant are the same thing. Aristotle views rational agreement between moral agents as agreement in shared standards of moral reasoning. Hume contrasts his view with this. According to Hume, his view is that agreement in sentiments, which is his 18th century word essentially for feelings or emotions, but agreements in sentiments is prior to and the condition of shared standards of practical reasoning. He held the view that this standard, the standard of practical reasoning, is provided by the, quote, general agreement in the sentiment of humankind. The general agreement in the sentiment of humankind. So it's a kind of intersubjective standard or basis for practical reasoning. What actions should we perform? What qualities of character or qualities of mind should we admire? Well, what we do is we consult our sentiments. We look into our own breast, as he might put it, and consult our sentiments. And we have to abstract from the particular biases and orientations that we might have that might lead us astray from the true standard, which is the general agreement in the sentiments of humankind, the way people nearly universally and normally feel about such matters. And if you're a relatively normal person, you will feel that way. But if you're not, then you're to be dismissed as an eccentric. So Hume believed that there was a broad and near universal consensus about what is pleasing or painful that was shared by all normal people. And everyone who was reasonably normal could confirm this merely by introspection. And then that standard of sentiment is what we would use to make our judgments. And we'll see an example of this shortly. But when we inspect what Hume thought such universal sentiments consist of, we see that they were not only specific to his particular time and place, but also to his specific social class. That is, they weren't even universal within, let's say, the British Isles of his day. For Hume, the socially defined roles and the social bonds that dictate different norms, virtues, and values in most human societies are irrelevant. The only bond of agreement is agreement in sentiment. So social role, social identity is irrelevant to standards of practical reasoning or standards of, for example, what virtues one should have if one is a householder or what have you. These sorts of things are irrelevant for Hume. It's only feelings that matter, only sentiments. And you can see here how Hume is very much the forerunner of expressivism. Hume invites readers to think of themselves merely as bare individuals, distinct from their social roles. The sentiments that Hume regarded as universal were, in some instances, radically at odds with what numerous people felt, even in his own time or place. So we see Hume comments, this is the bottom of page 82, and MacIntyre is quoting from Hume. So this is Hume. Avarice, or the desire of gain, is a universal passion which operates at all times, in all places, and upon all persons. Nothing has a greater tendency to give us an esteem for any person than his powers or riches. So two important claims here about these universal sentiments. Right? So he's saying that universally everywhere and at all times, people have felt a kind of pleasure in the idea of gaining more, getting rich. And they've felt a kind of admiration for people who are rich and powerful. Now, I think now certainly, I mean, we're not far enough away from Hume that it's completely foreign to us, this idea that someone might think that this is a universal sentiment, that in all places everyone has had a sentiment that favors greed, essentially, and also a sentiment of admiration for the wealthy and the powerful. Certainly there are many people that are like that, probably always have been many people that are like that. But whether this is a natural or universal sentiment is something much more questionable. And for MacIntyre, Hume's view of the natural and universal sentiments is a way of endorsing the socio-economic order of 18th century Britain. According to MacIntyre, the foundation of Hume's moral theory, his claim about natural and universal sentiments, is simply dead wrong as a matter of historical and sociological fact. Thus, Hume's moral theory is an instance of the nefarious social function that MacIntyre had warned about, misleading and distorting the social order. His theory serves to obfuscate what's actually the case, the actual facts of the matter of the social order. So, for Hume to disapprove of this sort of ceaseless and unending search for greater and greater wealth would be a kind of eccentric position. Individuals who are normal feel this in themselves, and they feel kind of admiration for the rich, and the richer, presumably, you are, the more admiration they feel. And to, for example, embrace voluntary poverty, like a religious ascetic, would be regarded as being a kind of eccentric character from Hume's perspective. But there could be, MacIntyre suggests, other possible reasons that Hume doesn't consider for the difference in sentiment. That is, a religious ascetic, for example, who disdains and feels a kind of disgust at people who seek to have gold faucets in their house and this sort of thing. That someone who feels that way isn't necessarily just an eccentric, but they could have a difference in their conception of human flourishing. Or also differences in position in the social structure, right? Someone who feels themselves to be exploited by the people with the gold faucets might have a very different attitude towards the rich than Hume imagines, or than Hume thinks they should. The differences in sentiment that Hume couldn't account for were, in fact, for MacIntyre, due to differences in beliefs about human flourishing, which motivated the sentiments and thus undergirded them, and not the other way around. That is, Hume's view that our beliefs about what's good and what's not is a function of our sentiments is, in fact, getting things backwards. And MacIntyre would even attribute to Hume a belief in human flourishing that was underwriting his approval of certain sentiments and disapproval of others. the fundamental ground level, so to speak, the foundational level, is the belief about what constitutes a flourishing human life and what doesn't, not the sentiment. The sentiment follows from the belief, not the other way around. So, for example, Hume's downgrading of monastic existence, the monastic life, or the monkish virtues, let's see what to call them, were motivated by his beliefs that about human flourishing and the idea that living a monastic life is not flourishing. And that's why he felt a kind of disdain for it. It wasn't that he felt disdain and then from that formed the belief. So Hume, in other words, lacked a certain self-awareness of his own motivations, of how his own theory was motivated, and of the function it was serving, the social function it was serving. And to see that, we need to place it back within its socio-historical context. And we need to learn something about the history of 18th century Britain and Ireland and Europe more broadly, and the different classes in that society. And MacIntyre has citations for this, at least one that I recall, sort of illustrating the kind of historical knowledge that can provide the background to show how this theory isn't something that is innocent of history, but it's very much part of the power struggles of history. Now, MacIntyre has to acknowledge, and he does in the next section, in section 3, that even Aristotle himself was a victim of the social and political assumptions of his time, place, and class, specifically the Macedonian and Greek ruling elite. And this is difficult to miss in going through Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, of course. In Aristotle, though, MacIntyre thinks this threatened to render his ethical theory incoherent, because Aristotle's ethical theory is based on the idea of there being a human function, that is, a function that is endemic to the species. And this function is to achieve distinctively human activity, which was activity in accordance with virtue. And yet, at the same time, he held, for example, that some human beings are natural slaves. So how does MacIntyre deal with this moral stain, as it were, on his hero? Well, by acknowledging that Aristotle needs to be rescued from himself, he says. Aristotle needs to be rescued from himself. MacIntyre thinks that Aristotle's importance is in his questions more than in his answers. And that actually, because Aristotle's theory is, in a certain sense, designed to be situated in a particular socio-political context, a particular polis, if you will, a particular social and political community, the kinds of questions that Aristotle encouraged us to ask have to be constantly given new answers. This is not to say that none of Aristotle's answers are still useful to us. They certainly are. But in a certain sense, with every important change in socio-political circumstance as we move through history, what Aristotelianism implies need to be sort of rediscovered for that particular context. Aristotle, in other words, provides for MacIntyre a kind of schema, a kind of outline, a kind of framework or structure. But this needs to be filled in anew in terms of the particularities of each individual's time and place. Aristotle also provides us with a schema for the justification of any substantive position in politics and ethics. The justification of any substantive position in politics and ethics. So the method that Aristotle uses of moral philosophy, MacIntyre regards as a generally valid method. What we do is we rehearse the objections to whatever position, substantive position we're thinking of putting forth. So we're thinking of putting forth some position. Let's say, we're thinking of advocating some kind of particular theory of rights or of, democracy or whatever the position may be. Any substantive position in politics and ethics, what we first do is we rehearse the objections. And this, of course, is going to be historically situated and historically relative. What are the best objections that have been, or that we can imagine could be, made to our substantive position at this time. So the people who, for example, kind of a communist perspective, for example, that might object to democracy as not being sufficiently concerned with the welfare of society, too individualistic, a kind of communitarian position, whatever it may be. But whatever the objections are, we rehearse those objections. And then second, we make the best possible answer to each of these objections and show how they fail. And this then is going to, of course, issue in constraints for what our theory has to satisfy in order to succeed. That is, whatever objections you're making against your opponents, you can't be guilty of the same failures. So the flip side of an objection that you raise to your opponent is going to be a constraint on your own theory that it needs to satisfy. And so then we advance, only then do we advance arguments for the conclusion. And this, of course, is going to show that we satisfy the constraints. And this is very much the structure of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And we can also see, of course, this structure reflected even more formally in Aquinas, in his dealing with objections and responding to them and so forth. MacIntyre says we inherit the best justified positions from the past. This is one of the points of studying the history of philosophy. Enable us to inherit the best justified positions of the past. We study the arguments of the most prominent positions of the past, the ones that have stood the test of time, as we say. But we always are going to need to revisit and reconsider these positions in light of new concepts, new positions, new arguments, new objections, and so forth. Obviously, in just the last less than a century, feminist critiques of many traditional positions, of course, have been raised and need to be addressed and incorporated and acknowledged in contemporary theorizing. So you can't just take a political position from centuries ago and assume that it could be valid in our time and place if it didn't take into consideration the kinds of concerns and objections that feminist philosophers raise, for just to take an example. So the way MacIntyre is conceiving of this is that ethical argument in this Aristotelian mode is going to be in one way interminable, because history doesn't end. We continue to develop, things continue to change, circumstances continue to change, and so new concepts are going to be invented, new positions are going to arise, there'll be new scientific discoveries that may transform our understanding of ourselves, etc., etc. So as these historical circumstances change, we're going to constantly have to revise and rethink and re-examine our position. But this isn't a cause for giving up on ethical inquiry or taking a skeptical position or something like that, because he thinks that we can still find that the case made for a certain position is conclusive so far. That is, at this historical moment, taking into consideration everything that is available to us based upon history up to this point, we arrive at this position that's the conclusive position. And clearly, Aristotle, MacIntyre is going to regard his version of Thomistic Aristotelianism as that position for us now. But at the same time, he's acknowledging that, well, what's going to be the situation 100 or 200 or 300 years from now? I mean, it's going to change. This is going to have to be opened up again. Now, Aquinas is useful, among other reasons, for MacIntyre, because he illustrated how to apply Aristotle to a different time and place. Aquinas' doctrine of the relationship of the natural law and the positive law was an important advance for MacIntyre over Aristotle, although very much within the spirit of Aristotle. And this enabled Aquinas' students, or rather the students of his students, the common people who would be taught by the clergy teachers that he taught. So Aquinas is teaching priests, clergy who teach common people. But this relationship of the natural law and the positive law is going to teach people to question the actions of those in authority and those in power. We saw how this worked in our examination of Aquinas in the earlier series. As MacIntyre reads it, the aim of the ethical text of the Summa is to educate in practical reasoning, to teach people how to direct their questioning so that they learn the ends they are to pursue and transform their desires so that they're rightly directed. Now, MacIntyre also sees Aquinas as someone who is, as you would expect a Christian to be, as opposed to an aristocratic Greek, someone who is more egalitarian in his orientation, more identified, which is not to say he's perfectly identified, but more identified with the concerns of ordinary people because of the intrinsic divine value that Christianity places on each human being, from the most powerful king to the lowliest, and even in a sense the kind of preferential treatment that Christianity traditionally has encouraged for the poor, who are regarded as the particularly blessed ones. So some of this concern with the concerns of ordinary people we see in Aquinas, and MacIntyre catalogs some of this on page 90. Aquinas' identification with the concerns of plain persons as practical reasoners is evident in the range of everyday issues with which he deals, the place of manual labor in our lives, whether we are permitted to gossip, the importance of truthfulness, the importance of jokes and the role of the traveling entertainer, the moral constraints on soldiers, the limits to the rights of private property when a legalistic insistence on them would prevent us from aiding someone in urgent need, the responsibilities of parents for instructing their children. Of particular interest to MacIntyre is Aquinas' reasoning concerning the ethics of the marketplace, and especially of the ethics of just pricing and the immorality of profit-making. We see here a kind of stark contrast with Hume and with Adam Smith in the 18th century sort of British mercantilist attitude towards these things, which is, it's good to try to achieve as much profit as you can. Whereas from the medieval ethical perspective represented by Aquinas, profit in itself is not a good. And in fact, pursued for its own sake, it's sinful. The very thing, this avarice that Hume regards as something that is naturally admired by all human beings universally, is regarded by Aquinas as contrary to human flourishing because it's contrary to the common good. It's all right to sell something for more than it cost you to produce it if that's necessary in order to be able to have something for yourself to meet your needs. But to charge prices higher than that would be regarded as immoral from a Thomistic perspective. For retailers to charge more is acceptable as long as it's enough to cover their own costs and to meet their own needs. But if they're charging more prices just because the market will bear it, this is unjust. Money, in general, is a good only as a means to achieve the common good. It enables us to exchange goods and thus share the products of our labor efficiently. But there's nothing good or admirable in the accumulation of profits themselves. For Aquinas, admiring someone just because they have a lot of money is perverse and a sign of decadence. A life devoted to the acquisition of money is characteristically a life of disordered desires. That is to say, the life of an immoral person. And this, I think, explains a lot of the unease that traditional Christians, especially Christians who are familiar with the Thomistic tradition, which is very much in line with traditional Christian ethics, feel with endorsing someone like Donald Trump, who clearly, if there's anyone who is ever a character with a disordered desire for money and wealth and conspicuous consumption, it's him. So without making any particular judgment on that, I just note here the difference of perspective. Someone like Trump, his ethic very much stands in the stream that goes through Adam Smith and Hume in the 18th century, the admiring of the person who can make a profit, who can make a deal, who can accumulate more wealth, and regarding this as a good thing, is good for society and all the rest. But for Aquinas, this is a sign of disorder. There's something wrong in your soul, and there's something unnatural about your desires. Different views of human flourishing, and that's MacIntyre's point. Adam Smith, of course, you probably heard of as the great dean of free market economics, but also he was, in his day, very influential as a moral philosopher. His theory of moral sentiments is a very influential work. And he was someone who believed that the marketplace is actually best pursued, or are best served, rather, by illusion and self-deception. The untrammeled pursuit of the illusory pleasures of riches, which is a form of self-deception, leads people on to seek more and more and more. They just think, well, if I was just making, another 100,000, then I would really be happy. And that's an illusion. Smith even acknowledges this, and certainly Aquinas would think this is an illusion. So you're dealing with an economic system here that's built upon lies. It's kind of an irony. So clearly a sea change took place in Europe between the 13th and the 18th centuries to transform the attitude towards social life and the economic marketplace from Aquinas to Hume and Smith. Modernists, people who are, go-go modernity, pro-everything modern and anti-everything medieval, would like you to believe that Aquinas and Aristotle were intellectually defeated by the Enlightenment in the intellectual arena. They were defeated in debates or something like that. But MacIntyre notes that few such actual debates took place. The change was not affected, in fact, by philosophical theorizing, but by social transformation. Social transformation that rendered Aquinas' thought irrelevant to the socioeconomic conditions on the ground. It created a social transformation, created a social environment where the traditional idea of, for example, the ends of particular segments of society, certain traditional ideas of the common good, didn't have applicability anymore to the actual social conditions on the ground. And so they sort of had the rug pulled out from under it, so to speak. That is what's actually happened. And so the question is whether we can imagine or create or find reason to imagine or create new social conditions that would create a more welcoming atmosphere for different forms of this traditional Thomistic moral and political thought. And you will return to that shortly in a couple sections. But first, at this point, here at the end of the third section, I want to ask our first discussion question, which is this. First discussion question. Is MacIntyre right that philosophical theorizing about ethical concepts will always to some degree be dependent upon the concrete socio-historical context in which that theorizing takes place? To what extent do the cases of Hume, Aristotle, and Aquinas illustrate the ways in which theorists are unconsciously influenced by the widespread cultural assumptions of their place and time? What implications does this have for the validity of any particular ethical theory? First discussion question once again. Is MacIntyre right that philosophical theorizing about ethical concepts will always be to some degree dependent upon the concrete socio-historical context in which the theorizing takes place? To what extent do the cases of Hume, Aristotle, and Aquinas illustrate the ways in which theorists are unconsciously influenced by the widespread cultural assumptions of their place and time? What implications does this have for the validity of any particular ethical theory? On to the fourth section of this chapter, chapter 2. For MacIntyre, the theorist who enables us to understand this social transformation to early modern capitalism and its significance is, unsurprisingly, none other than Karl Marx. The key notion of Marx that MacIntyre wants to draw attention to is the notion of surplus value. Surplus value. The notion that capital consists in unpaid labor. So the idea is basically that the value of the work of the workers is found in the exchange value of their product that they're producing, and the capitalist, of course, if the capitalist is going to get rich off the labor of the workers, has to pay them wages that collectively amount to less than the profit he can make on the product that they're producing. And so that profit represents money that he didn't pay to the workers for the value of their labor. That's the surplus value idea, roughly speaking. You Marxists out there, don't quote me too exactly on this. It's a rough idea of what's going on here. The idea that capital is uncompensated labor is what capital represents. MacIntyre asserts that in the High Middle Ages in Europe, people could grasp the truth of their socioeconomic condition in the theoretical idiom developed by Aquinas and Aristotle. By contrast, in modern capitalist societies, individuals systematically misunderstand themselves and their social relationships. That is, I mean, it's sort of obvious, right? If you accept the Marxist analysis and your boss is basically stealing from you with every paycheck, you're not going to sit still for that for long unless you've somehow been made to think that he's not doing that, right? And so the whole system of what Marxists call ideology is put into place, where one comes to believe that you are not an exploited worker who's been basically forced into kind of wage slavery due to the way in which the capitalist system exploits your needs. Your need, for example, to feed yourself and your family and shelter yourself and so on, but rather that you are a free individual who has freely exercised your autonomous will and has contracted with the capitalists to accept such and such wage for such and such day's work and so on. And so individuals are made to systematically misunderstand themselves and their social relationships in capitalism. This is the Marxist analysis now. I'm just giving the Marxist analysis. I'm not saying you need to accept this, but MacIntyre MacIntyre clearly does accept this, at least in its broad parameters, but he's contrasting it with the situation, let's say, if you accept the Thomistic picture, you don't have to deceive yourself about what your true relationship is. Of course, it might be that there's aspects of the Thomistic picture that don't fit the situation of, let's say, a peasant or a serf or something like that either. But at least he thinks that you accept, your relationship as it fits itself to the circumstances. That is, sorry, I said that wrong. That you have an understanding of your actual circumstances in the theoretical reflection that Thomas describes. Now, from a Marxist perspective, that might be ideology too. So there's a bit of a wrinkle there. It's not as if Marx is going to just accept that everything was perfect in the Middle Ages, and nor is MacIntyre. But the point is that at least people could have an accurate reflection of what their relationship was. So they believe that, yes, the Lord is, has a certain authority over me. I have certain duties to the Lord. And that was the actual reflection of what their social relationships were, and they believed in it. They believed in the theory as it was presented to them. It wasn't that they had to be deceived about what was actually going on. That's the view. They might have been deceived at some other level, for example, about whether Lord should rule over people and so on. Okay, back to the social conditions and economic conditions of modernity and the idea of surplus value. For the conditions of surplus value to be met, MacIntyre says, two conditions have to obtain. And this is just from Marx, that there has to be a dislocated labor force that's unable any longer to earn their living by working the land and thus are forced to hire themselves out as wage labor. And there has to be an owner class who owns the means of production. With the rise of capitalism, labor became a commodity, something to be bought and sold. But those whose labor became a commodity didn't generally recognize themselves to be such. So I guess, again, the contrast would be a serf. A serf in the Middle Ages understood himself to be a serf, and he accepted that as the natural order of things, rightly or wrongly. But a worker doesn't necessarily recognize themselves to be a commodity, even though that's what they actually are. So that's the difference, the disconnect. The rise of capitalism illustrates the way in which the dominant economic mode affects the dominant modes of social and moral thought as well. MacIntyre describes this on page 97. The relations of exchange through which those who own the means of production appropriate the unpaid labor of productive workers are disguised by their legal form as the contractual relations of free individuals, each of them seeking what he or she takes to be the best for himself. And as capitalism becomes the dominant economic mode of production and exchange, so this way of thinking about oneself and one's relationships becomes the dominant mode of social and moral thought, both among theorists and in everyday life, right? So we have the rise of, what this is saying is that the rise of individualism, like I am an individual, taking pride in being an individual. I make my own choices. I am not born into this land, for example, like a serf. I make my own choices to work for this employer as opposed to this and so forth. In modernity, the socioeconomic conditions of capitalism help to shape the questions that moral philosophy itself asks. So he mentions these questions on page 98, the next page. The question for each individual became, why should I not pursue the satisfaction of my desires with unbridled egoism, resorting to force or fraud whenever necessary? Versus, why should I be altruistic? So you can see the questions itself are framed in terms of sort of the typical ways of thinking and proceeding that are common within a capitalist system. Why shouldn't I just, do whatever it takes in order to get for myself whatever I can get? Why should I be altruistic? Why should I be concerned for the common good? These sorts of questions are another kind of questions that would be typically asked in the Middle Ages. That in the Middle Ages, it would be questions about things like what is the appropriate action or the appropriate virtue for someone with my social role who is ensconced in the relationships that I'm ensconced in society and so forth. Not this question of why shouldn't I be, just looking out for number one. That's a question that makes sense within a context where the ideology of individualism is dominant, and that's the capitalist context. So in capitalism, key concepts of the Aristotelian tradition, like final end, natural law, even the good, the common good, certainly, eudaimonia, these no longer have any application. These concepts became almost unintelligible because the context of social practices in which they made sense had become too different. So reciprocally, to challenge the dominant paradigm of moral theory requires not just an alternative body of theory, but a proposal of an alternative way of life. Do we need such an alternative way of life, or are things just hunky-dory in the capitalist world? Well, as you might anticipate, MacIntyre believes that there are great evils in capitalism, even though he acknowledges that there are things that have been good about capitalism, production of great wealth, lifting groups out of poverty, for example, in China and so forth. But at the same time, there are great evils in capitalism. And these are described on the top of page 100. Destroyed or marginalized traditional ways of life, gross and sometimes grotesque inequalities of income and wealth, lurching through crisis after crisis, creating recurrent mass unemployment, and left those areas and communities that is not profitable to develop permanently impoverished and deprived. So we have, what's innocuously called the business cycle that, of course, ruins people's lives through mass unemployment and all the negative social and health consequences that result from that. The clearing out and destruction of communities, think about the Rust Belt in the United States, all these small communities and even whole cities that are wastelands because capital has moved offshore and so forth. These sorts of things. So there are great evils of capitalism that could never have occurred in a kind of medieval system, for example. But of course, we can't go back to the Middle Ages. So the question is, what do we do about this? How do we fix this circumstance? Well, the first thing to do is to recognize what the actual situation is and to not obfuscate it with various academic ideologies. And this applies not just to modern moral philosophy, but also to, in particular, academic economics. It's not only modern moral philosophy that can serve to disguise and deceive. Academic economics is also like this. So in the next section, MacIntyre takes up a discussion of economics, as this is taught and pursued in research institutions, in universities and business schools. Economics took the form of an academic discipline in the 19th century under the influence of what's known as equilibrium theory, the theory that only unregulated competition within a free market can produce an equilibrium between supply and demand and thereby allocate resources efficiently. Economics quickly became a mathematical tool for the use of rational maximizers of utility. But one way in which economics is not a standard science is that the very textbooks that are supposed to provide economics students with theoretical explanations also inculcate a particular mode of thinking and decision making. In other words, if you go to business school, you major in economics, you are being indoctrinated. This is not just a neutral exposure to a science. You're being, in a way that is usually not voluntary, but is sort of implicit or tacit, a certain set of values is being placed in your mind. So the theory, in a sense, helps to create, not just describe the data that it describes. It helps to create the data, which are supposedly rational choices. The academic discipline of economics is not value neutral. There's a particular ethos built into its foundation. And this ethos is a very particular conception of what a rational agent is. Now, MacIntyre describes this conception, which the economist L.J. Savage, he says, was the first to make fully explicit. This is on page 102, second paragraph. To be a rational agent is to make rational choices, and to make rational choices is to take consistent account of one's preferences, of what one prefers to what and by how much, and of the consequences of the satisfaction of those preferences by choosing this rather than that alternative. That's what being rational is. Notice that nothing turns on how a particular agent may have arrived at his or her preferences. These, like the preferences of other agents that may have bearing on one's choices, are to be taken as given. To be rational is to be a consistent maximizer of preference satisfaction. This conception of what it is to be rational is deeply opposed by both the conceptions of Aristotle and Aquinas and the conception of ordinary people who haven't been influenced by capitalism. Academic economists are institutionally inclined to take a favorable or optimistic attitude towards capitalism. They believe, typically, that free market economies are the only engines of growth, that the recurrent economic crises that befall capitalist economies are to be chalked up to external factors, and the gross inequalities that result from the normal functioning of capitalism are to be viewed as necessary evils. They're justified by the way in which capitalism produces wealth, and there's a kind of trickle-down effect so that the most desperate forms of poverty in the world can be alleviated by capitalism, even if it also at the same time creates these gross wealth inequalities. However, MacIntyre sees at least four key ways in which the products of capitalist ways of thinking are rendered institutionally blind to the facts and prone to misrepresent reality with greatly detrimental effects. First, stock traders are only able to operate as they do by taking a relatively optimistic view of the uncertainties they face and the risks they're taking, which seems to work well until the market inevitably crashes. Markets operate in the real world, and every few years in the real world, some unforeseen event comes along to disrupt what had been taken for granted in the market transactions, to disrupt the model. For example, the recent pandemic. Third, traders are incentivized to take ever greater risks for the sake of ever greater profits. For example, in the subprime mortgage industry that led to the crisis in 2008. And they're led to sacrifice long-term prudence for short-term gain. And finally, traders are betting with other people's money in mutual funds. And with this money, from time to time, they casually and incidentally inflict great harm on people. But their education in business school or academic economics helps them put that out of mind. Now, MacIntyre acknowledges that some academic economists are aware of these problems with the capitalist system and have proposed remedies in the competing schools of Keynesians and monetarists, for example. But here we face another problem that's endemic to academic economics, and another reason that economics is not a real science, namely its lack of predictive power. economic theories are notoriously bad at predicting future events in the economy. Most recently, the 2008 financial crisis. This was something that was predicted by very, very few economists at all, and on empirical grounds rather than on theoretical grounds. It's not like there was some theory that predicted this was going to happen. A fatal flaw of academic economics, on McIntyre's view, is the assumption that the economy can be studied in abstraction from its psychological, social, historical, and political context. But it cannot. Economists themselves have not been disinterested scientific observers of the capitalist economy, but political influencers who have helped to shape and sustain it by providing legitimation for it. How often do we hear economic experts say that we need to have this particular pro-capitalist policy, right? But this has only led to ever greater economic and therefore ever greater political inequality. So McIntyre concludes the section this way. He says, economists, by playing their part in the legitimation of capitalism, have also played a part in the legitimation of inequality, and not only of economic inequality. For the power and influence of money in politics would not be what it is without economic inequality. And that power and influence are recurrently exerted to sustain capitalism. This is crony capitalism. Prime example of this is all green forms of green energy, so-called, which in a true free market could not sustain themselves. But they're propped up by essentially taking your income tax dollars and giving it to companies. And why is this done? Well, because these companies, or the more likely the capitalists who are investing in these things, donate to political candidates. The history of capitalism is thus in no insignificant part a history of economists. Academic economists have, to a remarkable extent, educated successive generations to think about the economic order in ways that make it difficult to resist the destructive and inegalitarian tendencies inherent in that order. It was no accident that Marx took it that any effective critique of capitalism would be impossible without an effective critique of economists. This leads to a second discussion question. Do you agree with McIntyre's claim that in the High Middle Ages in Europe, people could grasp the truth of their socioeconomic tradition in the theoretical idiom developed by Aquinas and Aristotle, but in modern capitalist societies, individuals systematically misunderstand themselves and their social relationships? How, if at all, does the academic discipline of economics, as taught in universities and business schools, contribute to this misunderstanding? So once again, second discussion question. Do you agree with McIntyre's claim that in the High Middle Ages in Europe, people could grasp the truth of their socioeconomic condition in the theoretical idiom developed by Aquinas and Aristotle, but in modern capitalist societies, individuals systematically misunderstand themselves and their social relationships? How, if at all, does the academic discipline of economics, as taught in universities and business schools, contribute to this misunderstanding? Okay. Now, in the next section, he discusses an alternative both to capitalism and to what we more familiarly associate with Marxism. That is communism or Soviet-style socialism. And this is distributivism, or distributism. He spells it both ways. Normally, this is the way it's spelled and pronounced. Distributism. And this is a view that's associated with various Catholic thinkers, especially G.K. Chesterton. Not Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton. Distributism. Chesterton was an late 19th, early 20th century Catholic social thinker in England. MacIntyre notes how Marxists are typically excluded from, or at least marginalized within, academic economics, which he attributes to the fact that their moral critique of capitalism runs against the institutional structural inclination of economics towards the legitimation of capitalism. Because MacIntyre regards the moral critique of capitalism to be a modern imperative, he's sympathetic to Marxism. However, his deeper sympathies lie with the Catholic social movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries known as distributism. Distributism was intended as a third way between capitalism and socialism, rooted in Catholic social teaching. However, the arguments for distributism were not religiously based. The appeal of the distributists, again, G.K. Chesterton was a leading figure. This was to all persons. The appeal was to all persons, whether they were religiously inclined or not. Distributism was based on the Thomistic notion that the goods of individuals, can only be achieved through the achievement of common goods in cooperation with others. In other words, the individual should not be conceived as a social atom apart from other social atoms in a loose aggregation, somehow, just agreeing to work with each other for the sake of their own private egoistic benefit. Rather, individuals should be conceived as being defined from the beginning by their social relationships that bind them to others as collective agents, families, workplace collaborators, members of private social groups and clubs, and fellow citizens. So distributism, through the work of people like G.K. Chesterton, sorry, I got that wrong before, it should be G.K., not C.K., not that it matters that much, but at any rate, it emerged as an alternative to Marxism in England after, various aspects, authoritarian and no doubt also irreligious, but that's kind of irrelevant here. But various aspects of the Marxist movements of the time began to drift more towards the endorsement of authoritarian state power. These have always been debates in Marxism, like what's the role of the state? Should there be a democratic state? Of course, you have democratic socialism and more authoritarian forms of socialism, and so forth. But distributism emphasized local control and grassroots initiatives based upon an ethic of mutual aid, cooperation, and the promotion of a counter-ethic to the capitalist ethos. So it fit into the broad kind of cooperative movement in England. Under capitalism, from the distributist point of view, not only are the workers demeaned, exploited, and impoverished by untrammeled pursuits of profits, but the ruling class as well is led to lead impoverished lives. The acquisitive ethos of capitalism and its consequent consumer culture is a value system that's detrimental to human development, period. Its development is detrimental to the human development of everyone in society. So distributism wasn't as inclined to see the needed political program in terms of class warfare as Marxism was. The alternative ideal for the English distributists was a Thomistic account of rational agency and human ends. Thomistic theory was combined with various small-scale practical initiatives, both economic enterprises, stores, clinics, cooperatives of that sort, and also forms of social life, clubs, societies, and so forth, typically in the form of cooperative enterprises. Okay, conclusion of this chapter. What have we learned about how to proceed beyond the impasse of chapter 1, which recall is the theoretical impasse between expressivists and neo-Aristotelians? So MacIntyre concludes this chapter by listing a number of morals about the nature of moral theorizing that can be drawn from this chapter's examination of Hume, Aristotle, Aquinas, Marx, academic economists, and the distributivists. First, he says, quote, on page 110, "The truth or falsity of theses in political or moral philosophy may depend upon what the historical and social facts are about human attitudes and activities, unquote. The truth or falsity of theses in moral and political philosophy may depend upon what the historical and social facts are about human attitudes and activities. That should be clear enough what that means by now. Second are some observations about the relationship between theory and practice. Theoretical inquiry always starts from pre-existing practice, which it aims to articulate and to develop further. Theory is then tested by attempting to put it into practice, which provides the judgment on the theory. Third, theorists need to be responsive in two directions: to those whose practice they are theorizing, and also to rival theorists. So to claim that their position is justified, they have to be able to respond to objections from each of the rival theoretical standpoints. The other rivals in their place and time, of course, according to the best standards of rational justification that they possess. Fourth, the examples of Hume and Aristotle show how, quote, we are apt to go wrong if we allow ourselves to be the victims of prejudices that inform widely shared judgments in the culture we inhabit, unquote, from page 112. Thus, we have to be suspicious of ourselves and of our attitudes and our feelings. There's a question that MacIntyre thinks that we ought to ask ourselves on page 112. What justifies my judgment that I am sufficiently independently minded to engage with integrity in the tasks of moral and political inquiry and justification? What justifies myself in thinking I'm sufficiently independently minded to engage in the tasks of moral and political inquiry? Reflection on this question points to the fact that possession of certain virtues is necessary and essential to successful inquiry. One is detachment from one's social and occupational roles, which involves a detachment from the objects of desire that belong to those roles, such as the desire for success, pleasure, and reputation. We have to care more about seeing and understanding things than in judging and acting ways that will curry favor with the establishment or that are familiar and comfortable to yourself. We also need a kind of sociological self-knowledge that will enable us to see how things appear from the perspective of the deprived and the marginalized in society. And we can see Hume's and Aristotle's deficiency in this regard, but we should learn a cautionary lesson from that. And have a kind of sociological self-knowledge. What's the condition of my society? From what perspective? And perhaps from what class interests am I theorizing? And this, MacIntyre thinks, requires a kind of asceticism, namely the disciplining of intellectual pride and overconfidence in one's natural attitudes, feelings, and achievements.